Section 10 of Imperialism and World Politics, Part 3 of 4, by Parker Thomas Moon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Alistair. Chapter 16c, The Policy of the United States Toward Latin America, Part 3. Subsection, Oil and Turmoil in Mexico. Much more important than the diminutive republics of Central America and the Caribbean islands, with which we have thus far been concerned, is the Great Republic of Mexico, a fourth as large as the United States, with a population, census of 1921, of about 14 millions. In Mexico, the conditions which usually constitute an invitation to imperial conquest were present in exceptionally high degree. Mexico was, and is, a peculiarly tempting morsel for imperialists. It would have been eagerly appropriated by the United States had imperialist sentiment there been as rampant as in France, Italy, Germany, or England. Even in spite of a stubborn anti-imperialist spirit in America, Mexico has been a sore temptation, a grave problem, one might almost say a provocation, to American imperialism. Mexico has been a temptation because of her marvellously rich resources, her peerless silver mines and productive gold mines, her oil wells which pour out a fifth of the world's petroleum, her copper and lead. Naturally, such wealth attracted foreign capitalists. The American investment in Mexican mining and smelting properties was estimated in 1902 at the figure of $80 million. In 1912, at $233 million. In 1924, at $300 million. The Guggenheim interests operating through the American Smelting and Refining Company with its subsidiaries, the Ryan and Coal interests operating through the Cananea Consolidated Copper Company, and the Phelps Dodge Corporation operating through the Moctezuma Copper Company, were giant figures in the Mexican mining industry. But there were scores of smaller concerns, and doubtless thousands of American small investors who depended on Mexican mines. The oil was practically untouched until 1901, when a veteran prospector from the United States, Mr. Edward L. Doheny, began to drill wells and laid the foundations for his two great oil companies, Mexican Petroleum, Mexican Pete, and the Pan American Petroleum and Transport, which soon made millions annually in dividends. Standard Oil also entered the field and became heavily interested. Meanwhile, a British company, the Mexican Eagle, controlled by Mr. Pearson, Lord Cowdray, became an aggressive rival from 1905 to 1913. By 1910, it controlled 58% of the Mexican output. Mexico won third, then second place among the oil-producing nations of the world, and most of her output was shipped to the United States. Other foreign capitalists provided funds for railways. To encourage such investment, President Diaz offered attractive terms, tax remission for 15 or 20 years, kilometric subsidies, one remembers the Baghdad Railway, ranging from $6,000 to $12,000 a kilometre, and grants of public lands. Early in the 20th century, the American capital invested in Mexican railways was estimated to be somewhere between $1/3 and $500 million. Another important foreign interest was in Mexican land, for cattle and sheep ranches or lumber. It has been estimated that from 40 to 60 million acres were acquired by Americans and other foreigners, and that about $275 million was invested in such land. Altogether, Consul Letcher reported in 1912 the American investment in Mexican railways, mines and smelters and other properties was a little over $1 billion. More recently, it has increased to about $1.25 billion. If British investments amounting to $2/3 billion and other foreign properties valued at a slightly lower figure are added, the total foreign investment in Mexico is well over $2.5 billion. Such investments were no menace to Mexico's independence as long as order reigned south of the Rio Grande. And order reigned on the whole during the long dictatorship of President Porfirio Diaz, a shrewd mestizo who ruled Mexico from 1877 to 1880 and from 1884 to 1911. With one firm hand, Diaz suppressed insurrections in Mexico, while with the other he welcomed foreign capital. With money borrowed from abroad, some 13,000 miles of railways were built. Concessions were granted on generous terms to foreign capitalists who wished to exploit Mexico's mines, her oil, her land. Diaz was praised as the strong man of Mexico, an enlightened despot. He was given the GCB by King Edward of England. All was well with Mexico from the viewpoint of the foreign investor. The whole situation changed, however, when in 1910 there began the Long Civil War, or series of wars, which lasted for an entire decade. The trouble arose from several causes. One difficulty was that the masses, descended mostly from the Aboriginal Indian inhabitants, and converted by the Spaniards to Christianity, were illiterate, poor, and exploited. The majority consisted of peons, agricultural labourers, living in a condition not much removed from serfdom, on the great haciendas of aristocratic landowners, or else dwelling in backward village communities, or in tribal groups which had hardly been touched by European civilization. A minority of them were miners and industrial wage earners. Of politics these people had little knowledge. Government they left to the small ruling class of Creoles and mestizos. But they had sore economic grievances. The labour question affected a relatively small number, but in an acute form, for wages were incredibly low, working conditions were atrocious, and radical labour agitation was making headway, although during the Diaz regime labour outbreaks were sternly repressed. The land question was much more serious as it affected most of the population. Under Diaz, public lands and unclaimed common lands were sold by the government to wealthy haciendos, estate owners, and land speculators. Probably more than a quarter of the total area was thus transferred. 90% of the villages on the Central Plateau were left landless, while many small owners lost their little farms and joined the ranks of discontented agricultural labourers held in bondage by debt. The census of 1910 shows that 6,000 haciendos owned 550,000 square miles, whereas only 1/4 of the land was owned by the common people in commons and small farms, and the agricultural labourers held in debt service, peons de campo, with their families made up over 60% of the total population. Here was good material for revolution. Ignorant, rebellious, shiftless workers were easily attracted to insurgent armies by promise of pay, plunder, and the free and easy life of the soldier. The situation was aggravated by other factors. The small governing class was divided against itself. Some advocated centralization, others states' rights. Some were scientificos, who believed in economic progress aided by foreign capital, and opposed demands of radicals for democracy, land reform, or labour reform. Some were anti-clericals, more or less of the French pattern, eager to legislate against the Catholic Church, while the majority devoutly upheld that church to which the bulk of the nation gave religious adherence. Such confusing cleavages combined with the inability of the masses to participate in government rendered fair elections and genuine representative government virtually impossible. Elections were usually farcical. Political leaders habitually placed more reliance on bullets than on ballots. The successful politician was the one who had a sufficient personal following and a sufficient number of troops back of him to seize power and defeat or intimidate his rivals. Diaz remained in power from 1884 to 1911 and was re-elected to the presidency 8 times, not because of his popularity, but because he had a loyal army and an active force of armed and mounted police, the rurales. His downfall was not caused by votes. On the contrary, when in the elections of June 1910 he found himself vigorously opposed, he cast the leader of the opposition, Francisco I. Madero, into jail, along with a number of his followers, and easily arranged for his own re-election. Madero, however, was no sooner released than he inaugurated a rebellion in the north, and announced that he and his followers believed in constitutional government, extension of the suffrage, a single term for the president, free elections and free press, the right of initiative in Congress, and the restoration of lands fraudulently taken from Indian villages and small proprietors. Madero himself appears to have been sincere in these ideals, but his own family, owning a large part of the land in the state of Coahuila, were opposed to land reform, and many of his followers were doubtless interested chiefly in obtaining power. Mr. Lane Wilson, former ambassador to Mexico, is reported to have alleged, on January 7th, 1913, that the Madero Rebellion was paid for by the Standard Oil interests. This particular statement may or may not have been unfounded, but it is typical and significant. Foreign interests, not merely oil, but mining, ranching, banking, and other interests were bound to be involved in the conflicts between rival factions in Mexico. Diaz had favoured Pearson, the British oil magnate, in granting petroleum concessions. American oil interests might naturally be expected to give moral, if not financial, support to the Mexican faction opposed to Diaz. Manuel Lior asserted that Madero promised to withdraw the Pearson concessions and be more generous to Standard Oil. As the story unfolds itself, other instances similar to this, and perhaps better authenticated, will appear. Moreover, foreign interests were necessarily involved in another way. Any serious civil conflict in Mexico was certain to interfere with mining and ranching and possibly finance. Foreign investments would be endangered, and foreign investors would demand intervention to safeguard their property. Such intervention could be by the United States alone, because there was so strong a feeling at Washington that the 20th century version of the Monroe Doctrine would not permit European intervention. To proceed with the story, the rebellion that began in the northern provinces in 1910 was so successful that in 1911 Diaz abdicated and fled to Europe with well-lined pockets, while Madero, of course, was elected president. Soon, however, Madero was confronted by insurrections in several provinces. One rebel general, a former muleteer, was financed by wealthy landowners in Chihuahua who feared land reform. Another rebellion, that of the Zapata brothers, was inspired by the opposite motives. The Zapatistas wanted more radical and more immediate land redistribution than Madero was likely to grant. The Yaqui tribe of Indians likewise lost patience and revolted. Moreover, a nephew of President Diaz made an unsuccessful attempt to seize power by force, was imprisoned by Madero, was liberated by rebellious military cadets. The coup de grace was delivered by General Victoriano Huerta, who betrayed Madero, seized power, made himself provisional president in February 1913. Shortly after, Madero and Suarez, the former vice president, were put out of the way, their execution being announced with the traditional formula that they were shot while attempting to escape. The cuartelazo, or coup d'etat, put the latent imperialism of the United States to the test. Huerta was regarded in Washington, as the letters of Walter Hines Page clearly prove, as a tool of Lord Cowdray, Pearson, the British oil baron who at this time was seeking additional concessions not only in Mexico, but also in Colombia, and accordingly Wilson decided not to recognize Huerta as president of Mexico. Wilson even went so far as to send an ex-governor of Indiana, John Lind, as his personal representative to invite General Huerta to get out, and to permit a free election in which he would not be a candidate. The sardonic Indian general naturally refused. In all this, Wilson was acting not as an imperialist, not as a champion of American oil interests, but as an anti-imperialist and as a Democrat. Latin America, he declared in his famous Mobile speech of October 1913, must be emancipated from foreign financial interests and concession hunters, as Colonel House wrote confidently to Ambassador Page on November 4th, 1913.
It is the policy of this administration henceforth not to recognize any Central American government that is not formed along constitutional lines. Anything else would be a makeshift policy. As you know, revolutions and assassinations, in order to obtain control of governments, are instituted almost wholly for the purpose of loot. And when it is found that these methods will not bring the desired results, they will cease. The President also feels strongly in regard to foreign financial interests seeking to control these unstable governments through concessions and otherwise. This, too, he is determined to discourage as far as it is possible to do so.
In the face of this new Wilson doctrine, Lord Cowdray renounced his intention of obtaining a concession in Colombia and concessions in Mexico. and the British government permitted Wilson to handle Mexico in his own way. Page commented in a private letter, "Cowdrey has, I am sure, lost, that is, failed to make, $100 million that he had within easy reach by this Wilson doctrine, but he's game." What would Wilson do with Huerta? The Wilson doctrine meant not only opposition to financial imperialism, but also disapproval of revolutions and dictatorships in Latin America. It meant insistence on orderly, constitutional, democratic government. It meant, if necessary, as Page put it, shooting men into self-government. Now Huerta was viewed by Wilson as a despotic dictator, worse still, a dictator stained with the blood of Madero and Suarez. On the other hand, Wilson believed that Huerta's antagonists, who called themselves constitutionalists, were genuine champions of liberty. Constitutionalists had taken up arms against Huerta, and through their leader Venustiano Carranza had declared their intention of restoring the Constitution and granting land to the landless. With such aims Wilson naturally sympathized, and there can be little doubt that when in December 1913 he declared his policy to be one of non-intervention, or watchful waiting, he cherished the hope that the Constitutionalists would soon be able to overthrow Huerta. But before many months had passed, Wilson found himself aiding in the elimination of the dictator. While Huerta was refused loans or arms, the Constitutionalist insurgents were permitted, beginning in February 1914, to purchase munitions in the United States. In April, a boatload of American Marines landing at Tampico were arrested by Huerta's troops, and although they were speedily released with apologies, the American Admiral Mayo refused to be satisfied with less than a formal salute of 21 guns as reparation for what he considered an insult to the American flag. National honor was now involved. Wilson's hand was forced. Reluctantly but firmly he supported Admiral Mayo's demand for the salute. Huerta was willing to fire the salute if the United States would give a written promise to return the courtesy. Such a promise, Secretary Bryan felt, might appear as recognition of Huerta and could not be made. As Huerta refused the salute without the promise, President Wilson asked Congress for authority to use force. Force was used, but in the most unexpected way. American troops were landed not in Tampico, but at Veracruz, April 21st, and after some bloodshed established themselves in that city. No salute did they obtain, but they seized a cargo of arms for which Huerta was waiting, and took charge of the customs house from which Huerta had derived revenue. Such measures definitely aided the Constitutionalists and hastened the downfall of Huerta. After Huerta's downfall in July 1914, the victorious Constitutionalist leaders, who had been expected to restore constitutional government, fell out among themselves and plunged Mexico into worse chaos of civil war. Probably the land question had much to do with the conflict. Carranza, the chief of the Constitutionalists, was pledged to a program of land reform which was not radical enough to suit the Zapata faction, but too radical to please the great landowners. It is said that some of the latter bribed Pancho Villa, an ex-bandit, who had won brilliant laurels as a Constitutionalist general, to turn against Carranza. At any rate, civil war continued among the Carranza, Villa, and Zapata factions, despite the attempts of the United States, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Bolivia, Guatemala, and Uruguay to bring the rival leaders into peaceful agreement, and finally Carranza, as the strongest of the three leaders, was granted recognition by the United States and other powers in the fall of 1915. Carranza's recognition as president, however, did not end the Civil War, nor did it settle the international difficulties. When, after many battles, Villa found defeat staring him in the face, he sought to evade disaster by the simple expedient of provoking American intervention. On March 9, 1916, he crossed the border, raided Columbus, New Mexico, killed 17 Americans, and fled back into Mexico. So easy as this was it to set in motion the familiar imperialist machinery of a punitive expedition. As France had sent punitive expeditions into Tunis and Morocco, as England had sent punitive expeditions into Afghanistan, so President Wilson now sent General Pershing into Mexico with 12,000 soldiers, to punish Villa, and 18,000 were stationed along the border, and presently 100,000 of the National Guard were brought up to the border. Invading another nation's territory is ordinarily an act of war, but if the invaded nation is a backward nation, it is only a punitive expedition, and so President Wilson regarded it. Carranza, however, and many Mexicans considered it a violation of Mexican sovereignty and adopted so hostile an attitude that the punitive expedition against Villa threatened to become a formal war on Mexico. It would have become such, and ended in conquest, had thoroughgoing imperialism reigned at Washington, but Wilson accepted mediation by other American nations, and at length withdrew Pershing's expedition in February 1917. Possibly the imminence of war with Germany hastened the evacuation. The expedition had cost over $130 million, and Villa had not been captured or killed. The most one can say is that American national pride had been gratified. Carranza was now free to carry out his program of constitutionalism and land reform. Just as the last American troops were leaving Mexico, he promulgated a new constitution, February 1917, which provided for a Congress elected by universal suffrage, a president elected for 4 years without the right of re-election, freedom of justice, and a number of radical social reforms, such as the 8-hour day in industry, a free employment bureau, a minimum wage, to be fixed by each state, a public health department, and so forth. It also declared the confiscation of church property and prohibited religious schools, thus manifesting the marked anti-clericalism of the Carranza faction. Moreover, the Carranza government proceeded vigorously with land reform. By September 1st, 1919, land grants aggregating 37,434,658 acres had been annulled. A large number of estates were broken up, and thousands of acres were restored or granted to villages and Indian communities. All this may have been satisfactory enough to the White House, but not to American business interests. Against the provisions of the new Constitution regarding land, labor, mines, and oil, a storm of protest arose in the United States. The breaking up of large estates in order to give small farms to peons and common lands to villagers was a menace to Americans who owned huge ranches in Mexico. Article 27 of the Mexican Constitution, declaring subsoil products, oil and metals, to be the property of the nation, and forbidding foreigners to acquire land, mining, oil, or industrial concessions unless they waived all right of appeal to their own governments, seemed to place the oil and mining interests in jeopardy. The oil question was particularly grave. In accordance with Article 27, the Carranza government ventured to impose royalty and rental taxes on oil lands, and a 10% ad valorem tax on all oil produced. Still worse, it announced that oil rights would be confiscated unless the companies claiming to have concessions for them at once registered their titles and proved that they were exploiting their oil lands. To be sure, in spite of taxes and decrees, the oil companies continued to increase their output and to pay large dividends, but they feared worse measures. With the support of the state government at Washington, they refused to recognize the Mexican government's right to nationalize oil rights, which had been granted by concessions from previous governments. The Mexican question became increasingly a question of economic imperialism, whether Mexico had the right to regulate or restrict the exploitation of Mexican resources, particularly oil, by American capitalists. The leading oil companies, as well as the Anaconda copper interests and others, formed a National Association for the Protection of American Rights in Mexico, with a press bureau on Fifth Avenue, New York City, to conduct propaganda against the attitude of the Carranza government. The Doheny oil interests offered $1 million retainer to President Wilson's son-in-law, Mr. McAdoo, who visited both Mexico and the White House in their behalf. And perhaps one might be warranted in the inference that there was at least some connection between the endangered oil interests and the lively agitation in the United States for active intervention in Mexico. Senator Fall, later implicated in the notorious oil scandals of 1923 and 1924, was conspicuous among the advocates of intervention. The inclusion of Senator Fall in President Harding's cabinet was sufficient indication that the new administration inaugurated at Washington in March 1921 was disposed to insist on American oil rights in Mexico. While a member of the cabinet, Mr. Fall received $100,000 in a satchel as a loan from his old friend Mr. Doheny, head of the Mexican Petroleum Company, or at least so Mr. Doheny later testified. The incident is illuminating as an instance of the methods by which imperialism sometimes operates. The Harding administration, as might have been expected, firmly championed American oil rights as opposed to the Mexican Constitution. Without a guarantee of American rights, the Washington government would not recognize the Obregon government, which, by the way, had taken office in Mexico in 1920, after a new revolution ending in the flight and murder of Carranza. Though Obregon showed himself a capable president and established order in the greater part of Mexico, and instituted commendable administrative reforms, and insisted that Article 27 would not be applied retroactively to the prejudice of oil concessions acquired prior to 1917. Nevertheless, he was denied official recognition. As the New York loan market was thereby closed to him, Obregon was willing to go far in an effort to obtain recognition. In 1922, his finance minister reached an agreement with a New York banker, Mr. Thomas Lamont of the Morgan firm, for resumption of interest payments on Mexico's debt of $500 million. The following year, Obregon came to a settlement with the United States government whereby lands obtained by Americans before 1917 were to be exempted from land reform laws, and mineral and oil rights conceded to Americans and exploited before May 1, 1917, were to be respected. In other words, the Mexican nationalization program would apply only to properties acquired since 1917. Further, the claims of the United States for a huge sum as damages for injuries done to Americans and their property during the tumultuous years 1910 to 1920, and the claims of Mexico for damages caused by the occupation of Veracruz and by the Pershing expedition were to be settled by mixed commissions. On these terms, Obregon purchased recognition in 1923. Hardly had these amicable arrangements been made when a new rebellion flared up in Mexico. Its leader, De la Huerta, a former member of Obregon's cabinet, may have been actuated solely by personal ambition. He claimed to be fighting against Obregon's attempts to interfere with freedom of election, but he was generally regarded as a candidate of the Conservatives, who desired that landowners should be indemnified for confiscated estates and that Labour radicalism should be checked. It was also alleged by Obregon that De la Huerta's rebellion was backed by British oil interests, particularly by El Aguilar, the Mexican Eagle Company controlled by the Royal Dutch Shell Combine. If this is true, it is worth noting that an American oil magnate, Mr. Doheny, lent Obregon $5 million to suppress the revolt, and that the House Teca Company, a subsidiary of Mr. Doheny's Mexican Petroleum Company, received recognition of its claims to most of the Juan Felipe Hacienda, a rich oil tract in the state of Veracruz. Mexico, it may be inferred, continued to be a battleground, not only for Mexican radicals and conservatives, agrarians and haciendos, clericals and anti-clericals, but also for Mr. Doheny's Mexican Pete, American, and Standard Oil, and Mexican Eagle, Anglo-Dutch. When Royal Dutch Shell had bought out Lord Cowdray's interest in the Mexican Eagle in 1918, and in 1925 the Standard Oil Company of Indiana bought up a controlling interest in the Doheny companies, Mexican Petroleum and the Pan American Petroleum and Transport, the battle lines were more clearly drawn between the greatest American oil combine and the powerful Anglo-Dutch syndicate. The magnitude of the battle may be gauged by the capital investment in the Mexican oil industry, which was estimated by the Mexican Department of Industry in 1923 at about $525 million, of which 57.7% was American ownership, 33.8% British, and less than 2% Mexican. In 1924, the United States Department of Commerce issued a semi-official estimate, placing the American investment in Mexican oil lands and refineries at $478 million, and in 1925 a Wall Street firm put the figure as high as 700 millions, Mr. Doheny in 1924 gave the amount of his own interests in Mexico at 218 million. Footnote. Footnote ends at 31 minutes and 48 seconds. New York Times, March 3rd, 1924. The following list of 10 leading companies producing oil in Mexico may be of interest. Production for 1921 is shown in millions of barrels, with percentages in parentheses. Huasteca Petroleum Company, Doheny, sold to Standard in 1925. 28.7 million barrels, 15%. Transcontinental Petroleum Company, Standard of New Jersey, 25.5 million barrels, 13%. El Aguilar, or Mexican Eagle, Royal Dutch Shell, 25.5 million barrels, 13%. Mexican Gulf Oil, Melon, 13.7 million barrels and 7%. Agui Oil Company, Atlantic Gulf, 12.1 million barrels and 6%. Texas Company, 11.3 million barrels, 6%. International Petroleum Company, Sinclair Interests, 10 million barrels and 5%. Island Oil and Transport Company, 8.9 million barrels and 5%. La Corona Oil Company, Royal Dutch Shell, 8.5 million barrels and 4%. Freeport and Mexican Fuel Oil Company, Sinclair, 8.1 million barrels and 4%. The table is compiled from data supplied by Mrs. Marsh. End footnote. It must never be forgotten, however, that the Mexican and United States governments are parties in the contest. Under President Calles, who succeeded Obregon in 1924, a new crisis was precipitated by the enactment of Mexican oil and land laws. The oil law reaffirmed the inalienable national dominion over petroleum resources and required foreigners to comply with Article 27 of the Constitution and seek confirmation within 1 year for concessions, leases and titles acquired prior to May 1st, 1917. The land law established a prohibited zone of 100 kilometres from the international boundaries and 50 kilometres from the sea coasts, within which zone aliens cannot acquire lands even as shareholders in a Mexican company. Aliens who now have such lands, however, may hold them until death. Aliens may acquire lands or mining concessions in the interior by becoming members of a Mexican company, renouncing all rights to invoke the protection of their own governments, and holding their property on the same footing as Mexicans. Against this legislation, there was a sharp outcry in the United States. Taking up the diplomatic cudgels for American interests, the United States government entered protests against the new laws. What the outcome will be was not clear when these pages were written. Subsection: North American interests in South America. In South America, the United States has been less vitally interested than in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean islands. Yet there has been some interest, especially in the countries bordering the Caribbean Sea, namely Colombia and Venezuela. Colombia, after Roosevelt's maneuver with Panama, long cherished bitter resentment and showed preference to British capital in granting oil and other concessions. On one occasion in 1913, Lord Cowdray had almost in his grasp a big concession for oil development, railways and harbour works in Colombia, when, in deference to the Wilson Doctrine, he dropped the negotiations. This incident revealed the importance of conciliating Colombia. Moreover, President Wilson sincerely desired to right the wrong which had been done to Colombia in 1903, and which had embittered the feelings of many South Americans toward the United States. Accordingly, on April 6, 1914, the American minister to Colombia signed a treaty expressing sincere regret for the Panama incident and promising to Colombia $25 million. The Senate, however, was reluctant to ratify a treaty which seemed to reflect so censoriously on a previous administration. Roosevelt indeed scornfully referred to the document as a
blackmail treaty.
But 7 years later, after Wilson had been replaced by Harding, a Republican Senate ratified the treaty, omitting the sincere regret clause. It has been alleged, but not definitely established, that ratification was in part due to the oil interests, which in other matters proved to be so influential with the Harding administration. Probably the desire in Washington to conciliate Latin American opinion in general was an important, if not the primary, reason for the payment of so large a sum to Colombia. It cannot be disputed, however, that American capital was very active in the oil fields, platinum mines, and banana plantations, nor is it difficult to foresee that as the oil industry develops in Colombia, a problem similar to, though simpler than, the Mexican problem will develop with it. Venezuela has been allowed to have its dictators and revolutions without interference, as American economic interests in this country have been relatively insignificant, although quite recently prospects have opened up of important mineral and oil development. The Largo Petroleum Company, organized in 1923, secured 8,000 square miles of oil land and soon became the largest producer in Venezuela. In 1925 it was acquired by a subsidiary of the Indiana Standard Oil, which had recently purchased control of the Doheny companies in Mexico and appeared to be launching a campaign, with the support of New York financiers, to win a dominant position in the oil lands of the Caribbean area. The chief opponent of the Standard, here as in Mexico, was the Royal Dutch Shell Combine, controlled by an Anglo-Dutch syndicate. Being on the Caribbean Sea, moreover, Venezuela is of considerable strategic interest and may be said to fall within the American sphere of influence. Fear that Great Britain intended to extend British Guiana by encroaching on Venezuela led, in 1895, to the celebrated Olney version of the Monroe Doctrine, referred to above, and to Cleveland's threat of war. Again in 1902 through 1903, the United States stepped forward to protect Venezuela, this time against an attempt on the part of Germany, Great Britain, and Italy to collect debts by means of naval blockade. Great Britain and Italy amiably withdrew their ships, but only a threat by President Roosevelt to send the American battle fleet to the scene could convince the German government that it would not be permitted to gain even a least port in Venezuela. It was on this occasion that Luis Drago, Argentine foreign minister, proposed what is known as the Drago Doctrine, namely, that European powers must not use armed force to collect debts in Latin America. This doctrine, we may well add, was approved by a Pan-American conference in 1906 and in modified form by 39 nations at the Hague Conference of 1907. As modified, it condemned the use of force for the collection of public debts unless the debtor country refused arbitration or refused payment of claims established as just by an arbitration court. Subsection Pan-Americanism. In the rest of South America, the interest of the United States has been less vigorous. To be sure, the Monroe Doctrine applied originally, and still applies, to the entire southern continent, as well as to Central and North America, and the United States would undoubtedly resent European or Asiatic encroachment on the independence or integrity of any of the Latin American republics. But the United States has evinced no concern over the settlement of large numbers of Germans in Brazil, Italians in Argentine, and of some Japanese and Chinese in several countries, nor has the United States attempted to exercise south of the equator the veto on concession or the same strict censorship of revolutions or the police power which have been asserted in the Caribbean region. Moreover, there has been a growing tendency in the United States to regard at least the progressive ABC powers, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, as associates rather than protégés. It has even been proposed that these, if not other South American nations, should become partners with the United States in maintaining a modified Monroe Doctrine, a mutual guarantee of independence. President Wilson, notably, in his address at the Second Pan-American Scientific Congress in 1916, proposed that the states of America unite in guaranteeing to each other absolute political independence and territorial integrity. The old Monroe Doctrine was blending in with the new Pan-Americanism. The Pan-American policy proposed by Secretary Blaine in the 1880s contemplated not only friendly relations and Pan-American conferences, but also a Pan-American customs union and a Pan-American railway, and common weights, measures, and coinage. His plan was never realized in its entirety, but at least a periodic conference of diplomatic representatives, the Pan-American Conference, was instituted, and later a Union of American States maintaining a bureau at Washington. Pan-Americanism developed mainly as an interchange of diplomatic amenities, of reciprocal assurances of goodwill, rather than as a sort of economic federation Blaine had conceived. The idea prevailed that the United States and the Latin American republics should be a group of states cemented together by periodic conferences, by friendship, by mutual regard for the peace of the Western Hemisphere. In this connection, it may be noted that the United States increasingly assumed the role of arbitrator in disputes between Latin American neighbors, between Costa Rica and Panama, between Chile and Peru, etc. What would happen if two South American nations should refer a dispute to the World Court, and one of them refused to accept the decision and resort to force, thereby incurring the penalties prescribed under the Covenant, is an interesting and not altogether academic question. For such an incident would perhaps involve European intervention, contrary to the 20th century versions of the Monroe Doctrine. Footnote. On the other hand, Article 21 of the Covenant gives the Monroe Doctrine a status in international law. It reads,
"Nothing in this covenant shall be deemed to affect the validity of international engagements, such as treaties of arbitration or regional understandings like the Monroe Doctrine, for securing the maintenance of peace."
End footnote. Another significant phase of American policy is the principle that in Latin America orderly constitutional government must be maintained, as against revolutions and dictatorships. This was a basic principle in Wilson's Mexican policy. It was expressed by Wilson in his speech of January 6, 1916, when he advocated an agreement
that no state of either continent will permit revolutionary expeditions against another state to be fitted out on its territory, and that they will prohibit the exportation of munitions of war for the purpose of supplying revolutionists against neighboring governments.
It was reiterated by Mr. Hughes as Secretary of State. It would mean a ban on revolutions. It means that the United States insists on the practice of its principles of constitutional government, whether other American states are qualified for it or not. Yet, oddly enough, it has been disregarded by the United States in Haiti and Santo Domingo, where American Marines have on occasion exercised a purely military dictatorship. Wilson aided the constitutionalist revolution in Mexico, and no consistent attempt has been made to censor revolutions in South America. In a word, the principle is not to be taken too literally. As regards economic matters, the affiliations of South America prior to the Great War were chiefly with Europe, particularly with England, for British capital built the South American railways, and British, German, and French shippers handled most of South America's foreign trade. It has been estimated that before the Great War about 1/5 of British overseas investments were in Latin America, and that the British holdings in South America amounted to about $3 billion. But the war enabled the United States to obtain a larger share of South American commerce, and New York rivaled London as the financial capital of South America. The National City Bank and others established many branches in Hispanic America. North American investors bought South American bonds and sought South American concessions. Consider, for example, the case of Peru, to whose government an American syndicate in 1925 loaned $7.5 million at 7.5% interest. The New Jersey Standard Oil, operating through the International Petroleum Company Limited, gained control over 80% of the oil production of the country. In 1925, the capital invested in Peru by the Standard Oil, the Cerro de Pasco Copper Corporation, the American Smelting and Refining Company, The Vanadium Corporation of America and other American concerns amounted to about $100 million, a fairly considerable and rapidly increasing sum, although it was only 1/3 of the total foreign capital invested in Peru. It was estimated that the new South American loans and investments floated in the New York money market during the year 1926 would amount to no less than $400 million. Toward the Colossus of the North, some South American nations had long felt suspicion bordering on hostility. They resented the assumption by the United States of the role of protector and spokesman for the New World. They were irritated by the condescension with which North Americans so frequently dealt with South American affairs. Above all, they were provoked by the imperialism of the United States in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. One eminent Latin American publicist wrote,
"To save themselves from Yankee imperialism, American democracies would almost accept a German alliance or the aid of Japanese arms. Everywhere the Americans of the North are feared."
This is no doubt exaggerated. It represented the attitude of extremists, yet in its way it indicates the reaction of Latin American nationalism against North American imperialism. Hoping to overcome hostile opinion in South America, Wilson proposed the new version of the Monroe Doctrine, which has already been mentioned, and on October 27, 1913, solemnly declared that the United States will never again seek one additional foot of territory by conquest. And Secretary Hughes repeatedly proclaimed that the United States had no imperialist aspirations, and indefatigable publicists have urged the substitution of a mutual guarantee for the Monroe Doctrine. And much propaganda has been directed toward the conquest of South American friendship. The substitution of Pan-American intervention for United States intervention, and of international financial receiverships for United States financial protectorates in the region between the equator and the United States, would perhaps keep order there more effectively and conciliate South America, and therefore aid American trade with South America. But such a substitution will be possible only when public opinion in the United States divests itself of the spirit of domination, discards the big stick along with dollar diplomacy, and learns to treat Latin American nations as associates rather than protégés. The great obstacle is not material interests, but a psychological factor, national pride, and national pride is the mother of imperialism. End of Section 10. End of Imperialism and World Politics, Part 3 of 4, by Parker Thomas Moon.